Late at night, the tall glass doors of Langford Corporation reflected the soft glow of city lights. Inside the grand lobby, a single figure moved quietly across the polished floor. It was Elias, the janitor, an older man with gentle eyes and hands worn from years of work. He pushed his mop carefully, making sure every corner shone before morning. The building was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the faint squeak of his cleaning cart. In the corner of the lobby stood a beautiful grand piano. Its black surface gleamed under the soft lights. Most employees passed by it every day without noticing, but Elias always slowed down when he saw it. Something inside him stirred every time he looked at the piano, like a whisper from another life. He had once known music, once lived inside it, but now it belonged to a world that had long moved on without him. That evening, the sound of laughter broke the quiet. The elevator doors opened and out stepped Richard Langford, the CEO, dressed in an expensive black suit. His gold watch caught the light as he walked in with a group of guests. They had just returned from a charity gala. Champagne still warm in their hands, the group was in high spirits, talking loudly and joking as they made their way toward the exit. Richard noticed Elias standing near the piano. The janitor's mop bucket was beside him, and for a brief moment, Elias's fingers brushed across one of the piano keys. The sound, just a single note, floated into the air, soft and pure. Richard stopped walking, his smile twisting into a smirk. "Hey, Elias," he called out in a teasing tone. "Didn't know we hired a musician to clean the floors." His guests laughed. Some of them took out their phones. Thinking this might be amusing to record, Elias froze, his hand still resting gently on the piano. He didn't look embarrassed, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir," Elias said softly. "I was just—" Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Just what? Practicing for a concert?" He joked. His friends laughed again, one of them saying, "Maybe he can play us a song while he wipes the tables." The laughter echoed across the marble walls. Elias lowered his gaze and nodded respectfully. "Of course, sir," he murmured, stepping back. He picked up his mop and continued cleaning, but his mind was far away. The sound of that single piano note still lingered in the air as if refusing to die. Richard walked past him, still chuckling. "Don't worry about the piano, old man," he said. "It's not a toy for janitors." The group left the lobby, their laughter fading as the doors closed behind them. When the building grew silent again, Elias leaned on his mop handle and looked at the piano one more time. His reflection stared back at him on its glossy surface, not the man he used to be, but the man he had become, quiet, invisible, forgotten. He reached out and pressed one more key. Just one, and this time he smiled faintly. The note was soft and lonely, but beautiful. It reminded him of nights long ago when he had played on real stages under bright lights, when applause had filled the air instead of silence. For a few seconds, the lobby didn't feel empty. It felt alive again. He closed his eyes and imagined his late wife sitting in the front row, her smile gentle and proud. She had always believed in his music, believed that no matter how dark the world became, music could bring light. That memory filled his chest with warmth and pain all at once. Elias sighed and turned away. He knew his place in this world now. He wasn't a pianist anymore, just a man with a mop and memories. Still, every time he passed that piano, something inside him refused to let go completely. As he finished his shift and switched off the lobby lights, the moonlight from outside fell softly across the piano's keys. It was as if the night itself was waiting for him to play again. But he didn't, he simply whispered, "Maybe someday," and pushed his cart toward the elevator. Upstairs, the CEO sat in his office, still amused by what had happened. He didn't know that the janitor he mocked once played in Europe's grand halls. He didn't know that the hands holding a mop had once brought audiences to tears. For now, their worlds stood apart. One man proud and powerful, the other quiet and forgotten. But fate had already started to move its pieces. The same piano that caused laughter tonight would soon make the world listen. And the man everyone mocked as a janitor would remind them what true music sounds like. The night after the laughter in the lobby, Elias sat alone in his small apartment. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. His hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly from age and exhaustion. In front of him stood an old electric keyboard. One corner cracked, a few keys missing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to hold the sound of his memories. He stared at the instrument for a long time before touching it. When his fingers finally pressed the keys, the notes came out uneven and soft. The sound was broken. but it carried something that no expensive grand piano could hold. Truth. His fingers began to move slowly like they were remembering their purpose. And as the music filled the room, Elias was no longer a janitor. He was a man who once played to hundreds, whose melodies had once brought silence to crowded halls years ago. Elias had been known as Elias Gray, the pianist who could make people cry without saying a word. He had trained in Vienna, won competitions, and performed in concert halls lit by chandeliers. But then came the car accident that took his wife, Clara, and their unborn child. After that, no amount of applause could fill the empty space in his heart. His music died the day she did, and with it, his will to continue. He sold his piano, moved back home, and disappeared from the world that once knew his name. When the bills piled up, he took whatever job he could find, eventually becoming a janitor at Langford Corporation. He never spoke about his past, not even when people mocked him. He let them see only the quiet old man who mopped the floors, never the soul that once danced with melodies. That night, though, as he played his small keyboard, something inside him stirred. It wasn't anger from the CEO's mockery. It was something deeper, a whisper that said his story wasn't over yet. The music poured out of him like water from a cracked jar. Imperfect but honest, he played until tears blurred his vision, until his fingers began to ache. In the silence that followed, he looked at the photo frame on the small wooden table beside him. It showed him and Clara smiling under a banner that read, Vienna Conservatory Graduation. Her eyes seemed to sparkle even now. He reached out, touching the glass, and said softly, "You'd laugh at me, wouldn't you, Clara? A janitor still dreaming of music." He chuckled weakly, but a tear rolled down his cheek. Suddenly, his phone buzzed, a rare thing. Since few people ever called him, it was a message from Amelia, one of the building's younger receptionists. She had seen what happened that evening and felt terrible. Her message read, "Mr. Elias, I'm sorry about what they did tonight. It wasn't fair. I just wanted to say your playing those two notes were beautiful." He smiled faintly, surprised anyone even noticed. He typed back slowly, "Thank you, child. Music has a way of remembering us even when people don't." The next morning, he went to work early. The lobby was empty again, the air still cool from the night. He walked over to the grand piano and gently wiped away the fingerprints left by last night's guests. His reflection looked back at him, tired but alive. He ran a finger along the edge of the instrument, whispering, "Not yet, old friend, but soon." Later that day, Richard Langford arrived with his team for a meeting. He barely glanced at Elias, but something about the janitor's calm expression unsettled him. For the first time, Richard noticed that the man's hands didn't look like a janitor's. They looked like hands made for something precise and graceful. He pushed the thought away, laughing at himself for even thinking it. In the break room, two employees whispered about the incident from last night. "He really played a note," one said, "and it sounded different, like it had weight." The other shrugged. "Maybe old people just get sentimental. He's just a janitor." Elias overheard but didn't respond. He had learned long ago that silence was stronger than words. He focused on his work, humming softly under his breath. The melody was one he used to play for Clara. It was warm, hopeful, and full of life. That night, when he finished cleaning, he didn't go home right away. He sat by the piano once more, the building empty around him. Slowly, his fingers touched the keys again. This time he played a simple tune, something light and full of heart. The sound echoed softly through the marble hall. Upstairs, unknown to him, a security guard watched the camera feed, frozen in disbelief. He turned up the volume of the monitor just to listen. The janitor's music filled the control room with something he hadn't felt in years, peace. And while Elias played, unaware that anyone could hear, a small smile returned to his face. For the first time in decades, the man who once lived in silence began to feel alive again. He didn't know it yet, but that small act, the decision to play again, would change everything. The same piano that had witnessed his humiliation would soon become his redemption. The next morning arrived with sunlight spilling through the tall windows of Langford Corporation. Elias stood quietly at his station, polishing the floors near the entrance. The sound of his mop echoed faintly across the marble. He looked calm on the outside, but deep down, his thoughts replayed the memory of the piano, the laughter, and the way his fingers had trembled when he touched that single key. But something was different now. The humiliation hadn't broken him, it had awoken something old. Something alive. The company was buzzing that morning. Employees hurried through the lobby carrying folders and coffee cups, whispering about the upcoming 50th anniversary gala. It was going to be the grandest event Langford Corporation had ever hosted. The city's most powerful people were invited. There would be press, cameras, fine dining, and of course live music as Elias cleaned. He overheard two employees talking near the elevator. "Did you hear?" One said. "The pianist just canceled. Apparently he got sick." The other groaned. "Oh, great. The CEO is going to lose his mind." He wanted this event to be perfect. They walked away quickly, not noticing the quiet janitor behind them. Elias paused, the mop still in his hands. The piano stood silently in the corner, its keys gleaming like tiny memories. His heart beat a little faster. He knew it wasn't his place to think about it, but part of him whispered, maybe this is it. Later that afternoon, chaos broke out upstairs. The secretary rushed through the halls. Phone pressed to her ear. "We need a replacement," she said sharply. "It's only 2 days before the gala." No one knew what to do. When the CEO, Richard Langford, found out, he slammed his hand on the conference table. "Unacceptable," he barked. "We can't have silence during the biggest night in company history. Find anyone who can play." That's when one of the assistants, trying to lighten the tension, joked, "What about the janitor? He seemed interested in the piano last week." The room erupted in laughter. Richard's face softened into an amused smirk. "Oh yes," he said, "our in-house musician, Elias the janitor." The others chuckled, but Richard leaned back in his chair, suddenly thoughtful. "Actually, why not? Let's have some fun. Tell him he's invited to perform if he refuses. At least we'll get a laugh." The message spread quickly. And by evening, Elias received a call from the HR office. "Mr. Elias," said the voice hesitantly, "Mr. Langford would like you to perform piano at the anniversary event." For a moment, Elias thought it was a cruel prank, but when the caller assured him it was real, he simply said, "If that is what's needed, I'll do it." After he hung up, Elias sat down heavily on his small couch. His hands trembled not with fear, but with something far more powerful, hope. It had been decades since he'd performed for an audience. His heart pounded at the thought, but this time, it wasn't about applause or recognition. It was about reclaiming the voice he'd buried under years of silence. That night, he dusted off his old music sheets from a box under his bed. The paper was yellowed, edges torn, but when he touched them, the memories returned. He could almost hear Clara's laughter echoing in the room. "Play it like you mean it, Eli," she used to say. He smiled softly and whispered, "I will, Clara." "I will." The next day at work, people whispered behind his back. Some laughed openly. "The janitor's really going to play." One said, "What's he going to do, play the mop like a flute?" Another joked. Elias heard it all, but he didn't let it touch him. He spent his lunch breaks near the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys. Not to practice, but to feel. Each note hummed quietly, reminding him that music didn't care about who you were, only that you felt something when you played. By the end of the week, the grand ballroom was ready for the event. Chandeliers sparkled, tables were dressed in white silk, and cameras were being tested. Richard Langford stood on stage giving orders to the staff. When he saw Elias quietly inspecting the piano at the corner of the stage, he grinned. "Don't break it, old man," he said mockingly. "That thing's worth more than your yearly salary." Elias smiled faintly. "Don't worry, sir," he replied. "I'll treat it like an old friend." As the CEO walked away laughing, Elias sat down at the piano. He pressed one key and let the sound linger in the empty room. It was rich, deep, and alive. He closed his eyes, letting the vibrations run through him for a moment. He was no longer in a ballroom. He was back in Vienna. Under bright lights, his wife's smile glowing in the crowd. He exhaled slowly and whispered to himself, "This time they'll listen." And when he stood up, the quiet promise hung in the air like a note that refused to fade. The laughter of the CEO no longer mattered. The stage that once belonged to others was now waiting for him. And he intended to play not for applause, but for the truth that lived in his music. The night of the company's grand celebration arrived. The Langford Corporation's 50th anniversary gala was the kind of event people would talk about for weeks. The ballroom shimmered with gold lights. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like captured stars, and the sound of polite laughter mixed with the soft clinking of wine glasses. Every corner of the room spoke of wealth, Elegance and status, the CEO, Richard Langford, stood at the center of it all, smiling proudly as if he owned the world. Outside the ballroom, Elias stood near the doorway, his hands trembling slightly as he straightened his simple white shirt. He had no tuxedo, no polished shoes, just clean clothes and the quiet dignity of a man who had seen both greatness and loss. A few staff members gave him sympathetic glances while others snickered softly. One of the servers whispered, "He's really going to play?" "What a joke," another chuckled. "Maybe he'll mop the stage afterward." Elias heard them, but his heart stayed calm. He had faced far worse than laughter. He had faced silence. As he stepped into the ballroom, the room went still. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. Some people raised their eyebrows. Others exchanged amused looks. The grand piano sat on a low stage, shining under soft light like an old friend waiting patiently. Elias took a slow breath and walked toward it. Every step echoed on the marble floor. Richard Langford leaned toward one of his guests and whispered, "Watch this, it'll be good for a laugh." The guest smirked. Sipping his drink, Elias reached the piano and ran his hand gently across the lid. He felt the smooth surface, cool under his fingers, and for a moment, he was back in his youth, hearing Clara's voice say, "You were born for this." The crowd murmured softly, expecting nothing more than a clumsy attempt at music. Some already had their phones ready to record the funny moment, but when Elias sat down, his back straight, eyes closed, something changed in the room. The way he touched the keys wasn't the way of a janitor. It was the way of someone who respected sound itself. The first note rang out, soft and uncertain, then another and another. Each tone fell into place like raindrops on glass. The melody began to build, gentle at first, then full, alive. His hands moved with surprising strength and grace. The air filled with music that shimmered and swayed. It carried sorrow, love, and something that no one in that room could quite describe. The laughter stopped, glasses were lowered. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Every note Elias played seemed to tell a story, of a man who had lost everything but still chose to create beauty. His music spoke of nights spent alone, of tears shed in silence, of memories that never died. Richard's smirk slowly faded. His eyes narrowed as recognition dawned. This wasn't random talent, this was mastery. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes fierce, sometimes tender. The audience felt it too. People leaned forward in their chairs, some forgetting to breathe. The sound filled the ballroom until it seemed the walls themselves were listening. Elias's face was calm, but his eyes glistened. He played not for fame, not for forgiveness, but for his wife, for the promise he made years ago that he would never let the music inside him die. The world had laughed, life had beaten him down, but here he was, proving that even a broken heart can still create something beautiful. When the song reached its peak, his hands blurred across the keys, every note flowing like water from a river that had been waiting too long to break free. And when it ended, he let his hands rest gently on the piano. The final note hung in the air, long, trembling, refusing to fade. Silence followed. Not one person moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the chandelier lights. Then slowly someone began to clap, another joined, and another, until the entire room was on its feet, applauding wildly. Elias stood and bowed his head humbly, his eyes filled with quiet tears. He wasn't smiling for pride, he was smiling because, after so many years, he had finally been heard. Richard Langford rose from his seat, his face pale and expressionless. He felt something twist in his chest, guilt mixed with awe for the first time. He realized the man he had mocked was greater than any title, greater than any wealth. Elias stepped away from the piano, his hands still trembling slightly. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "For you, Clara," and turned to leave the stage. As he walked past the tables, people reached out to shake his hand. One woman whispered, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," another man said. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Elias only smiled and said, "In another lifetime." From that moment on, the atmosphere in the room changed. The laughter that once mocked him was gone, replaced by awe and respect. The janitor had become the heart of the night, and while everyone celebrated, Richard Langford sat quietly in his chair, watching the humble man disappear through the crowd. For the first time in years, the CEO didn't feel powerful. He felt small. He realized that money could buy a piano, but it could never buy soul. And that night, the janitor's music had given everyone in that room something priceless, the sound of truth, The sound of applause still echoed in the ballroom long after Elias had left the stage. People stood in stunned silence, their emotions tangled between disbelief and awe. For a few moments, it was as if time itself had paused to honor what they had just witnessed. Then the murmurs began, soft, hesitant, like people waking from a dream. "Who is he?" Someone whispered. "That couldn't have been real," said another. But it was, and deep down, every person in that room knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Richard Langford sat frozen at the head table. His glass of champagne trembled slightly in his hand. The laughter that had once come so easily now stuck in his throat. He forced a smile for the guests congratulating him, but his eyes stayed fixed on the stage where the janitor had sat moments ago. The image wouldn't leave him. The old man's calm face, his steady hands, the haunting melody that refused to fade from Richard's mind. A few guests approached him. "Richard," one of the board members said, "where did you find that pianist?" "He's incredible." Another added, "You must sign him for future events. He's world-class." Richard could only nod slowly, his thoughts spinning. He hadn't found Elias for his talent. He had invited him as a joke, and now the joke was on him. Meanwhile, Elias sat quietly backstage. Away from the noise, his hands rested on his lap, still trembling slightly from the intensity of his performance. He looked tired, but there was a soft glow in his eyes. The years of silence had been broken, and the music that had been trapped inside him finally found its voice. The event manager entered the room. "Mr. Elias," she said gently, "they're asking for you. Everyone's talking about your performance." He smiled faintly. "Let them talk," he replied. "Music doesn't need my face, it just needs to be heard." As he prepared to leave, a young journalist approached him. She had been covering the gala for a lifestyle magazine. "Sir," she said softly, "your performance moved the entire room. I'd love to know your story. Who taught you to play like that?" Elias hesitated, then answered in a voice calm and humble, "Life taught me, miss, life and loss. Both are good teachers." He gave her a small smile and walked away, leaving her stunned. She knew instantly there was more to this man than anyone had realized. Outside the ballroom, the night air was cool and still. Elias walked toward the bus stop, his jacket folded neatly over his arm. He didn't have a car, didn't need one. The streets were quiet, but inside him there was peace. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't need praise or recognition. He had found his purpose again, back inside. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. "Find out everything about him," he told his assistant sharply. "Now." The assistant nodded and hurried off. Within hours, the company's PR team dug up fragments of Elias's past, old newspaper clippings, photographs from European concerts, reviews praising Elias Gray, the prodigy from Vienna. When Richard saw the photos, his jaw tightened. The truth hit him like a blow. The man he had mocked, the man he had humiliated in front of his guests, had once been a world-renowned pianist, a man who had shared stages with orchestras and legends. "Good God," Richard muttered, running a hand through his hair. The guilt settled heavy in his chest. He realized how blind he had been, judging a man by his uniform instead of his soul. The next morning, when Elias arrived at work, the atmosphere was strange. People looked at him differently. Some smiled awkwardly. Others stepped aside respectfully. Even those who had laughed at him days earlier now avoided meeting his eyes. He went about his duties quietly, pretending not to notice. As he wiped down the piano in the lobby, Richard walked in. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something heavier, shame. For a moment he just stood there, watching the old man clean the instrument that had made the whole city talk. Then he spoke, his voice lower than usual. "Elias." Elias turned. "Good morning, sir," he said kindly. Still polishing the piano, Richard swallowed hard. "I owe you an apology. I was wrong. Deeply wrong." Elias smiled faintly. "You don't owe me anything, sir." The music was apology enough. The CEO looked confused. "Apology?" Elias chuckled softly. "Music reveals truth, sir. Sometimes we don't need words. The sound already says what the heart feels." Richard nodded slowly, humbled. "If you ever wish to return to the stage, Langford Corporation will sponsor anything you need," he offered sincerely. Elias looked thoughtful for a moment, then shook his head. "Thank you, but I'm fine where I am. I play when the world is quiet. That's enough for me now." When Richard left, Elias sat by the piano and played a small, gentle tune. The melody was simple, but it carried peace. The security guard nearby closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, and just like that, the lobby that had once echoed with laughter now glowed with calm. The same piano that had been a source of mockery had become a symbol of truth. In the days that followed, everyone in the company spoke of the janitor who played like a master. Some called it a miracle, others called it fate. But to Elias it was neither. It was simply music doing what it always did, reminding people of what truly matters. He didn't know that outside the building, the journalist who had met him was already writing her article. Her title read, "The Janitor Who Played the World Silent." The morning after the gala, the city's newspapers carried a surprising story. "The Janitor Pianist Who Silenced the Rich," read one headline. "From Mop to Master, the Hidden Virtuoso in a Corporate Hall," read another. Elias's picture was everywhere. A modest man in a white shirt sitting behind a grand piano, eyes closed, hands frozen in the air like he was still listening to the music he'd just played. The building buzzed with excitement when employees saw the news. Some were proud, some embarrassed, and some pretended they had always known. "I told you he was different," one whispered in the elevator. "Can you believe he used to perform in Vienna?" Another said. They all suddenly wanted to be close to him. The same man they once mocked. But Elias didn't care for attention. He came to work quietly, just as he always had, mop in hand. Steady steps, soft smile. His routine didn't change, but the way people looked at him had. Some nodded respectfully, some smiled nervously. Even the security guards greeted him like an old friend. When he passed the lobby piano, he paused as usual, gently dusting it off before moving on. To him, it was never a symbol of fame. It was simply a way to speak without words. Meanwhile, in his top-floor office, Richard Langford sat staring at the newspaper spread across his desk. The story had made his company famous overnight. People praised his eye for hidden talent, though he knew he didn't deserve that credit. Every compliment felt like salt in a wound. He leaned back in his chair and muttered. I laughed at him. The guilt gnawed at him all day. At one point, he called his assistant and said, "Get Mr. Elias up here. I want to speak with him." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, he's cleaning the West Wing right now," Richard sighed. "Then I'll go to him." It was something no one had ever seen before. The CEO walking down to the janitor's floor. Richard found Elias mopping near the glass corridor, the sunlight bouncing off the shiny tiles. Elias looked up, surprised. "Good morning, Mr. Langford." Richard cleared his throat, looking almost uncomfortable. "Elias, I wanted to talk to you privately." Elias nodded, leaning his mop gently against the wall. "I owe you much more than an apology," Richard said quietly. "You showed me something last night, something I can't forget. You made me realize how blind pride can make a man." Elias smiled kindly. "Pride makes noise, sir. Music makes silence. Sometimes silence teaches better." The CEO laughed softly, shaking his head. "You speak like you play, with meaning." He reached into his pocket and handed Elias a small envelope. "This is for you." Elias opened it. It was a letter of recommendation and an offer. "A performance contract," Richard explained. "Several concert halls reached out this morning. They want to host you. They want you back on stage. I told them I'd make sure you said yes." Elias stared at the papers for a long moment, his eyes misty. His heart swelled with emotion. He hadn't stood on a real stage in decades. The idea both warmed and frightened him. "Thank you, sir," he said finally, "but I'm not sure the stage wants me anymore. My place is here among quiet people." "Not flashing lights," Richard frowned. "Elias, this could change your life." Elias smiled faintly. "It already has," he said. "Last night was enough. I didn't play to be seen. I played to remember who I was, and I found him again." The CEO stood there speechless, realizing that the janitor's contentment was something his millions could never buy. Days turned into weeks, and the legend of the janitor pianist grew. Reporters came to the building asking for interviews, but Elias politely refused. The music said all it needed to, he'd tell them. The company received letters from around the world, people writing about how his story inspired them to follow their forgotten dreams. One day, the journalist who had met him backstage returned, carrying a framed magazine cover. It featured Elias with the headline, "Humility and Harmony, the Man Who Played the World Silent." She smiled and handed it to him. "You change people's hearts." "Mr. Elias," He accepted it quietly, placing it beside his locker. He didn't see fame. He saw a reminder that music still mattered. That evening, when most employees had gone home, Richard found Elias again, sitting at the piano, playing softly. The lobby lights were dim, and the melody floated through the empty halls like a warm breeze. Richard stood silently listening. The music wasn't grand or loud, it was gentle. Full of forgiveness, he realized it was a song of peace, not triumph. When Elias finished, he looked up and said softly, "Do you hear it, sir?" "Hear what?" Richard asked, almost whispering. "The sound of grace," Elias said with a faint smile. "It's what happens when pride finally learns to listen." Richard didn't answer, but his eyes softened. He gave a small nod and left quietly. That night, the janitor who once played for empty rooms filled an entire building with meaning. His story had already reached millions, but for Elias, the only audience that mattered was the silence that followed each note, the silence that meant he had finally been understood. The article about Elias's performance had circled the world in less than a week. News stations covered it, talk shows discussed it, and online communities shared the clip of the quiet janitor, who had played like a legend. The story touched millions, people who had given up on their dreams, who suddenly felt hope again. But while the world celebrated, Elias remained the same. He still took the morning bus, still greeted the guards with his soft smile, and still began his day with a mop in his hands. He didn't chase fame. Fame had already left him once before, and he had learned how empty it felt when it vanished. Every morning, people stopped to greet him. Some brought small gifts, flowers, chocolates, even letters. "You made me cry," one woman told him. "Your music reminded me of my father." Elias thanked her quietly, his heart warm. He never expected the world to listen again. And now that it did, he didn't want to lose the peace he'd found. One afternoon, as he polished the piano keys, Richard Langford entered the lobby with a group of reporters. "Mr. Gray," Richard called. Using his real name for the first time, Elias looked up in surprise. Richard smiled proudly. "You're famous now. You deserve to be recognized." Elias shook his head. "Fame isn't the goal, sir. Purpose is." But Richard insisted. "The Philharmonic wants you to play with them next month. It's a charity concert for music education. They've asked for you by name." Elias was silent for a moment. He ran his fingers over the piano, the smooth surface reflecting his tired but gentle eyes. "For the children?" he asked softly. "Yes," Richard said. "They want you to perform to inspire young musicians." Elias nodded slowly. "Then I'll play." The announcement spread fast. The janitor pianist returns to the stage. Tickets sold out in hours. The media waited eagerly, hoping for another viral performance, but for Elias, it wasn't about attention. It was about giving something back to the world that had forgotten its heart. When the night of the concert arrived, the hall was filled to the last seat. The lights dimmed and the crowd hushed. On stage, Elias walked slowly toward the grand piano, wearing a simple black suit, no designer brand, no glitter, just quiet dignity. When he sat down, the entire audience leaned forward. His first note was soft like a whisper. Then came another and another. The melody told stories words couldn't. It spoke of struggle, patience, and the beauty of endurance. In the front row sat Richard, eyes glistening, beside him. The journalist who had first written about Elias wiped away tears. Behind them, young children from local music schools listened, their small hands gripping the edges of their seats. Halfway through the piece, Elias paused. He looked up and said softly into the microphone, "This song is not about talent or fame. It's about time, time that tests us, time that heals us, and time that never takes away what's truly meant for us." Then he began to play again. The hall filled with light, not from the chandeliers, but from the emotion his music carried. The melody soared high, dipped low, then rose again with a quiet, aching power. It was raw, human, and beautiful. When he finished, there was silence, pure, deep, respectful silence. Then the applause began, loud and unending. The children clapped the hardest, shouting, "Bravo, Mr. Elias." After the concert, reporters surrounded him, but he waved them off gently. "Please," he said, "let the children speak instead. They're the music of tomorrow." Richard joined him backstage. "You could have anything now," he said earnestly. "Money, sponsorships, fame. You've earned it." Elias smiled and shook his head. "I don't need to own anything. I only need to give. Music isn't mine. It belongs to whoever listens with their heart." As he left the stage, One little boy ran up to him, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "Mr. Elias, I want to learn piano like you," the boy said breathlessly. Elias knelt, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then promise me one thing," he said softly. "Never play to impress others, play to express yourself. When you do that, even silence will listen." The boy nodded, eyes shining. That night, as Elias returned home, the streets were quiet. The fame, the cameras, the lights all stayed behind. He walked slowly through the cool air, his heart at peace. In his apartment, the old broken keyboard still sat by the window. He turned it on, its hum uneven, and began to play a simple tune. Through the cracked keys came a melody that sounded like gratitude. Elias smiled softly and whispered, "Clara?" They finally heard it, and for a moment, as the city slept, it felt like somewhere beyond the stars. His music was reaching her too. Weeks turned into months after the concert. Yet the world still spoke of the humble janitor who played the piano like his soul had lived 1,000 lifetimes. Elias Gray had become a quiet legend. His name appeared in magazines, schools hung his picture in their music rooms, and young pianists whispered his story before recitals as if it were a prayer. But Elias remained unchanged. Every morning he still took the same bus, carrying his worn bag with lunch neatly packed inside. He still greeted the guards, still smiled at the receptionists, and still took a moment every day to run his hand across the piano in the Langford lobby. For him, fame had not been a door. It had been a mirror, reminding him of who he really was. One evening, as the office emptied, Richard Langford descended the marble staircase. Finding Elias sitting at the piano again, the lights were dim, the city glowed through the glass windows, and the music floating through the air felt softer than ever. "You still play here after everything?" Richard asked quietly, walking closer. Elias smiled without stopping. "Where else would I play, sir? This place once laughed at my silence, now it listens." Richard chuckled. "You could fill concert halls every night, Elias. You could be rich again." Elias finished his melody and turned toward him. "I already am, sir, rich in peace, in purpose, in sound." There was something so calm in his tone that it silenced any argument Richard could have made. The CEO nodded, humbled once again. Later that week, the company unveiled a new installation in the lobby. A golden plaque was placed beside the piano, engraved with the words, "In honor of Elias Gray, whose music reminded us that greatness wears many uniforms." At the unveiling, the employees gathered around, cameras flashed, but Elias stood back quietly, eyes shining. He didn't want attention. He wanted the piano to be the focus. When Richard called him forward, Elias spoke softly. "Music doesn't come from wealth or skill. It comes from what you've survived. This piano heard my pain, and it turned it into peace." The crowd applauded, many with tears in their eyes. Even those who had once mocked him felt their hearts stir with guilt and admiration. In the days that followed, something beautiful began to happen. Employees would stop by the piano during breaks. Some played clumsy notes, others just sat beside it in silence. The music had transformed the building. It wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was a place where people remembered to feel. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled softly outside, Elias stayed behind after his shift. The lights were low, and the lobby shimmered with reflections of raindrops racing down the glass. He sat down at the piano and began to play one of Clara's favorite songs. The melody was warm, gentle, almost like a conversation between the living and the gone. As the final note faded, he closed his eyes and whispered, "I kept my promise, my love." Unbeknownst to him, the security cameras caught the entire moment. The next morning, a guard who adored Elias uploaded the video with the caption, "Even after fame, he still plays for her." Within hours, it went viral again. Millions watched the frail old man sitting alone in the dim lobby, pouring his heart into a song meant for one soul who could only listen from the other side. People across the world shared the video, saying, "This is what love sounds like." The following week, letters flooded in from around the globe. Students, soldiers, nurses, and even prisoners wrote to Elias, thanking him for reminding them that kindness and passion still existed. He read every letter, smiling softly at each one. One morning, a letter came from a small town's music school. It was from the little boy who had met him after the concert. "Dear Mr. Elias," it read, "I've been practicing every day. I play for my mom now, just like you played for Clara. I'll never forget your words. Play to express, not to impress." Elias folded the letter gently, his eyes misty. "Good boy," he whispered. As time passed, his steps grew slower, but his heart remained light. The company offered to retire him with honors, but he refused. "Let me stay a little longer," he said. "There's still music in these halls." One evening, the janitor's bench near the piano was found empty. A half-finished cup of tea sat beside it. The piano lid was open, and the last sheet of music he'd been writing lay on the stand. One final melody. Incomplete. Richard Langford attended his quiet funeral days later, along with hundreds of employees and strangers who had never met him, but felt they knew his soul. The church was filled with soft piano music, played by the little boy from the music school. After the ceremony, Richard returned to the company and had the final sheet framed beside the lobby piano. Below it, he added one last plaque. Elias Gray. He didn't play for applause. He played for truth, and the world listened. Now every morning, when the first rays of sunlight touch the piano's keys, the sound of his music still seems to linger, faint but eternal, reminding everyone who passes through that building that greatness doesn't shout. It whispers, softly, through the hands of a janitor who simply loved to play.